My name is Professor Myles McGregor-Lowndes. I'm an adjunct now at the Australian Centre for Philanthropy and Non-Profit Studies, having been the inaugural founding director of the centre. And this evening, it's an honest conversation, and it is about how can non-profits and government work better together. But first, let me acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which QUT stands. The Queensland University of Technology acknowledges the Turrbal and Yagara as the First Nation owners of the lands where QUT now stands. We pay our respects to their elders, laws, customs and creation spirits. We recognise that these lands have always been places of teaching, research and learning. QUT acknowledges the important role Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people play within the QUT community. So welcome all to this honest conversation today, and in particular welcome to Glenn Poole, Michael Hogan and Chris Seiboth. I will introduce them later in more detail. However, welcome our panellists. Our first panellist this evening will be Glenn Poole, and we will be able to have questions at the end of the session. But if you would like to use the Q&A facility to post questions as they pop into your mind, then I will try and keep track of them and feed them to the panel at the appropriate time. So welcome all, and Glenn, over to you.
Thanks, Myles, and it's great to be here tonight. I've been involved in a number of not-for-profit community groups over the years, but it's probably my experience as a senior executive in the State Treasury and as the Auditor-General that has shaped most of my views about tonight's topic. Although my experience has been within the state government sphere, I believe that the issues are largely the same, whether it's at the Commonwealth, the federal level, or the local government level. Before the speakers discuss how non-profits can have better relationships with government and how we can get better outcomes, I want to look at the changing relationship between those sectors over the years. I think that an understanding of the type of relationship that the two parties have is critical to a discussion on how they can work better together. In the early years in Treasury, that's going back to the 1970s and 80s, the non-profit sector was largely seen as separate from government. The organisations mainly operated to do things in the community that had no direct link to the services that the government provided. Many non-profit services were complementary to those provided by government, particularly in health and education, but those activities were seen as add-ons rather than core government services. Any government funding to non-profits was therefore seen as simply supporting the community-based initiatives. In fact, one of my bosses in Treasury at the time described the rationale for deciding what organisations should be funded along the lines that government money should follow community interest and funding. That is, the government should prioritise its funding in this area towards those activities that are already shown some community support by way of dollars or volunteers. It was perhaps an indirect way of identifying what additional services the community sought to have and what they valued. Many of the government funding arrangements in those years came under the heading of grants in aid, which I think is an indicator of how the relationship was intended to be. So if the grants in aid were simply supporting the NGOs, the relationship between the funder and the organisation would be a fairly simple and supportive one. The environment today, however, is quite different. Although there are many non-profits whose objective is to undertake activities that are unrelated to government, that's not where I suspect most of the government funds go these days. Rather, it's to those non-profits who are providing services that the community expects from government, but where the government, for a variety of reasons, has decided to outsource the service delivery. So how did this change come about? Through the 80s and 90s, the expectations on government grew and there were demands for them to be more accountable to the community. And as community expectations for accountability increased, government also then increased their need for information and control over how the funds were going to be used. At the same time, I think the demands from the community changed, and that the distinction that there had been between government services and community services blurred rather, and there was an expectation that community would provide services funded by the government. Thus, the government started to become more prescriptive and looked to set about controlling the type and quality of how the services should be undertaken. And that changed the working relationship. If you go on to slide 3, I think, yep, so that covers where we've been. On to the next slide. In 2007, the Audit Office completed an audit of the management of funding to non-government organisations. Back then, which was 2005-06, the government was spending about, this is the Queensland State Government, was spending about $3.7 million in advances to non-profit organisations, and it has increased significantly since then. So we're talking about a fairly large amount of money. In the audit, we looked for a framework to describe the relationships, and we used the interaction that the National Audit Office in the UK had used in a model that described 3 different descriptions for government funding: giving, investing and shopping. The giving category was funding without any real outcome objectives other than allowing the NGO to get on with doing its thing, and there was very little of that. Investing was a bit more of that, which was funding to enable an organisation to acquire infrastructure or training to strengthen the organisation's capacity to provide its services. So the funding was directed at building up the organisation rather than delivering the delivery of the services themselves. The third category was shopping, where the government was looking to fund specialist services for the benefit of the community. And a lot of my conclusions that came out of that audit were that most of the transactions at the time could be classified really as shopping. Intriguingly though, the departmental staff of the time, and even in the last 5 years or so, were using words such as grants or partnerships rather than shopping, even if they were using a competitive or a tender approach to select who they were going to fund and for what services. At the same time, it was clear that the government was not really providing funding at a level that covered the full cost of service delivery by those organisations. It was not clear to me then, and it still isn't today, whether government was being deliberately misleading about their funding arrangements or whether it was simply being unintentionally loose with their use of the language. It was also strange that the community accepted a situation where governments went shopping for the delivery of services and did not expect to pay the full cost of those services. Since then, the government and non-profit relationship has continued to evolve, and other ways of looking at funding, such as co-design, commissioning and consumer-directed funding models have been introduced. So I think it's critical for non-profits to clearly identify the type of interaction and relationship that they're entering into with the government departments. Unless there's a clear understanding and acknowledgement by both parties of the transactions, the type of relationship that is intended, it'll be very difficult for there to be a constructive base on which to build great outcomes for the community. I'll leave it to Chris and Michael to explore some of those issues in more detail. Back to you, Myles.
Thank you, Glenn, for bringing that perspective as a former Auditor-General of Queensland. It now turns to me to have a few words. So if we can have the next slide, Eleni, and the next one after that, and the next one, thanks. Yep. I call this the only gorilla in the forest slide. And what I want to talk about is for community services, there is not usually an open market to determine contractual terms. It is what we call a monopsony. That's where the government is the sole buyer or funder. And there you see the economist's definition of monopsony. It means that monopsonies usually have the characteristics of inappropriate risk transfer, micromanagement, disincentives to innovate, and poor service provision. And my contention is that we can see this in the government outsourcing of services to the public. And it is partly due, in my view, to the relationship and how that's configured in the contractual documents which govern that relationship. These provisions exist because government can just insist on them. It's you take it or you leave it. And they have provisions in their grant agreements which would never find voice in commercial relationships, particularly between equal parties. They may find voice when there is a monopoly and you're able to impose terms on people. It's no way to have a relationship when you've got to have a willing partner to impose terms on them, particularly where there's inappropriate risk transfer. It should be on the basis of which party is best able and most efficiently able to manage the risk. Micromanagement, and I think we've all suffered from that in the sector from time to time. And there are disincentives to innovate, because if you do things cheaper, better and faster, you just have your money clawed back at the end of the period. So it's a disincentive. And all these were identified by the Productivity Commission back in 2010 and in subsequent reports by the Productivity Commission into various sector subsectors over the years. My contention is that my contention is that the government and the parties don't in fact follow the written contracts or grant agreements. They fall into the bottom drawer and just get on with a good relationship anyway. The danger with this is that when something gets a bit difficult, then out it comes from the bottom drawer and things go to custard because the terms aren't appropriate. My solution to this is to suggest that governments face some disciplines in the market when there is uneven bargaining power. And in the federal sphere, the ACCC, consumer legislation, now has provisions for unfair contracts. So big corporations cannot impose take it or leave it contracts on small business, and it must be fair. And the test is, it is not reasonably necessary in order to protect the legitimate interests of the party who would have been advantaged by the term. So if a term is not there to reasonably project a legitimate interest, then it shouldn't be there. So this would cover such things as boilerplate, indemnity. Anything goes wrong, whether it's your fault or not, you've got to indemnify the government. Search, seizure and inspection on your premises at any time of the day or night, often a power given to governments in their contracts to walk into your premises, demand any records and demand visitation at any time of the night, sometimes without due notice and consent. These sorts of contractual provisions ought not to be in contracts when you're trying to promote a helpful and trusting relationship. I think at the bottom of this is that those that draft these contracts and administer them have got to realise that there's not one size contract or one type of contract which fits all. You've got to recognise the difference between contracts, and that there are different styles of contractual terms to fit the particular relationship. And if you can imagine a spectrum, a line, at one end you've got contracts for specific goods which are commoditised, monetarised and fungible. Things like petrol. I mean, petrol's petrol and sells for a price. Internet download, gas, all these things are specific contracts, or for pencils or pens. At the other end of the spectrum, of the continuum, we have contracts which require utmost good faith. So they're joint ventures. These are contracts where the parties don't know how they're going to reach the product or the end or the service, but they agree to work together to mutually get to that end as a joint venture. And governments engage in these sorts of contracts. They know that there needs to be a bridge across the Brisbane River, but they don't know what is the most efficient type of bridge for the design specifications that they want. So the contract won't specify how the bridge is to be built, but it will specify a process about how you get there. My suggestion is that contracts for the provision of complex and human services to solve wicked social problems are more down the joint venture, joint arrangements end, where you can have different processes which may not be quite identifiable at the beginning of the contract in order to do this. So in my view, if government wanted to be more amenable to working in partnership or working with non-profits in order to solve wicked problems, it needs to shift its contracting regime down to the other end. I see we have one question and answer. Job providers under the job seeker scheme. Yep, that's a good question. Government have many tools now, and Chris is going to go into this about delivering, it's not only grant contracts, but we have voucher systems, joint quasi-market options, NDIA, NDIS, for housing, joint ventures and projects, and I think they've got a lot more tools. But at the bottom of it, you need to pick the right contract. But let's move on to Michael Hogan first. Michael was appointed Director-General of the Department of Communities, Child Safety and Disability Services in April 2014, and continued as Director-General role for the Department of Child Safety, Youth and Women since late 2017. He has spent time in the sector prior to that and has recently joined QUT as an adjunct professor. So Michael brings a huge perspective of the day-to-day grind and highest policy level, as well as the frontline issues from the state government perspective. So Michael, over to you.
Thank you very much, Myles, and thank you, Glenn, too, and thank you to the Centre for hosting this webinar on an honest conversation between government and non-government organisations. I suspect that we'll have some furious agreement emerging from Glenn's introduction and Myles, your insight into whether the ways and means we use at the moment to regulate that relationship are fit for purpose. I guess my view and my experience, now having worked in and out and in and now out again of government, now over 35 years and through lots of changes, that at the moment those tools and those relationships aren't as fit for the shared public purpose that we have and the commitment that we have between government and non-government organisations to create public value. And so I think in particular, I don't think they're fit for purpose in the context of complexity that you've noted. I do want to sort of visit this through the lens of COVID, if that's okay. It's a bit hard to avoid at the moment. So Lenny, could we go to the slide, please? I thought I'd start by sharing a quote from you, which really caught my eye back in June this year, from a guy called Andrew Liveris. I'm not sure if anyone else has been aware of him. He was a former CEO of DuPont, and indeed he was a member of Donald Trump's advisor. Having come back to Australia when he retired from DuPont, he was appointed as an advisor to the National COVID Commission, and he made a point at a very important couple of points in the real midst of we were grappling with the COVID crisis. And he makes a point firstly about the divorce that was emerging between democracy and capitalism. And I make the point because he's put his finger on a real tension that the very much market-defined marriage, as he called it, has also been the way in which we've thought very much about the relationship between government and non-government. And Glenn touched on this. But what COVID has done is exposed the challenges of those old paradigms in actually being able to cope with the profound challenge of COVID, but even the pre-existing challenges of inequality and poverty, of the challenge of enabling people to have a good life in a relatively well-off community such as Australia. The other point he makes, though, is that COVID also exposed some extraordinary of our communities and indeed of our community organisations and our public systems, and I refer there to our government systems and our non-government systems. They're both public purpose systems, and he recognised, because I think all of us felt how powerful it was, those expressions of community and care and connection were in that really profoundly challenging first phase of our COVID experience. I think in those insights, actually, there are some really interesting points about then that go to the issue about the relationship between government and non-government organisations. Eleni, can we go to the next slide, please? So I think it is worth reflecting on what COVID has shown us. On the one hand, COVID, as I've said, has indicated that we are very fortunate, and thank goodness that we have robust and agile public health systems, public care systems, but they are fragile, and in particularly what we've seen in aged care and in the early years has exposed some really clear pre-existing weaknesses in a number of our human service systems and our care systems. It's, of course, a challenge that's not just going to go away quickly. We know from the impacts of disasters and something as deep and wide and broad as COVID that it will actually worsen inequality and vulnerability and complexity. And we're seeing that in what NGOs are reporting and governments are reporting in terms of the numbers of people who had never needed before coming forward to government and non-government organisations. The increases in reported instances of domestic violence, the challenges of keeping a line of sight to children at risk, the reported anxiety and stress particularly experienced by people who've suffered employment loss or loss to their business, and especially for young people. We also know that the COVID has, as I said, really exposed some challenges in our care systems, and of course they're primarily staffed by women. And so we've seen that those care systems are woefully undervalued, and the vulnerability and the falls in our care systems has really been exposed. So I guess my take out on that, and I think this is sort of reflected in lots of the insights from commentators globally that old neoliberal paradigms, the sort of market paradigms, are deleterious to community and to connection and to care. And so that creates, I guess, a real moment for a change in the relationship between the market, the state and community, for non-government organisations and government. So Lenny, could we go to the next slide? I've been able, since I finished in government, to be part of a number of coalitions, one of which is the Australia Together coalition, that pretty early on turned our attention to what should recovery look like and how would we frame recovery in a way that addressed both the consequences of COVID as well as pre-existing issues. And, we about what should be the priorities for social investment, not just hard infrastructure investment. And that include a focus on health, on housing, on early years, on aged care, and on community. And so we thought that what had been missing is a strong enough focus on community and the importance of place in the way in which we approach recovery. Along with many, many others, we've also really argued strongly that there's a need for a reset, a revaluing of our care systems and a rethink of human services. In particular, how critical it is human connection, human agency and human development and growth as design principles for our human service systems. And that we needed to do something about the fragmentation and the competition driven in large part by the way in which services are commissioned or procured, and that we needed a much more of a systemic approach and an approach around co-production and co-investment. And I think that goes to Myles' point about the sort of instruments we use really fit for the complexity and the sort of relationships that we need to create the sort of opportunities and supports for people experiencing vulnerability. And hence the need for a stronger focus on investing in people and places with an inclusive and sustainable growth lens. For NGOs, I think that has a number of implications, and as it does for government. And of course, one of the really vital roles that NGOs have played in the last 6 months is being a conduit for the voice of people experiencing that vulnerability and that precarity, people faced with the challenge of being able to bounce back when they're already experiencing disadvantage. So I just really want to encourage the folks from the NGO sector who are here to keep on doing what you do incredibly well, and as being a conduit and enabling the voice, the lived experience of people to be heard in the public sphere and by people who are making decisions about policy and investment. Of course, it's also, I think, a moment when we really ought to be galvanising about, well, what are the critical reforms that should follow, not so that we don't snap back to old ways that maybe are no longer fit for purpose, but in particular, what ought to be the ways in which we do collaborate for value and for results that help shift people's lives. And I think that does call for quite a significant rethink of our commissioning processes. And there are examples now of like pooled funding, consortia-based commissioning, the co-production that we really ought to now sort of take to scale and start to shift what happened across government, within agencies, across agencies and across levels of government. And of course, I do want to note that this week is Anti-Poverty Week, and I think it is again worth acknowledging the extraordinary work and the contribution both to the amelioration and the prevention of social and economic exclusion and disadvantage that our NGOs contribute to. So as we move in Queensland toward the next government after the end of October, I do encourage NGOs to be very vocal in sort of helping the government define what sort of society we want and the sort of reforms that should go with the way in which we support Queenslanders, especially those experiencing vulnerability. I'll leave it there and let you go back to Myles, over to you.
Thank you very much, Michael. Yeah, I've got some questions there. But let me introduce Chris Seiboth. Chris is the Executive Lead Community Services of Innovation at Lutheran Services Australia. Chris is an experienced C-suite executive with an extensive experience of working in the public sector and not-for-profit organisations. Has a wide range of experience in primary care, subacute, acute hospitals and community services. He has qualifications and research interests in social science, community development and horticulture. Chris, over to you.
Thank you very much to everyone involved, and I would like to, just acknowledge that photo of me, how quickly I've aged in the last 5 years. That was taken when I joined Queensland Health 5 years ago. Sadly, the grey has, maybe it's the tropics after living and working in South Australia for many years. If we could go to the next slide, I wanted to have a look at basically what I'm describing as a very, very short history of public good service provision in Australia, because relationship with governments are always going to change, and often by looking backwards we can start making predictions around what is the nature of that relationship and which elements of the current relationship do we really want to foster, develop and grow in that true partnership with government, whether we are a not-for-government provider or representing a government organisation. For myself, I'm a little bit the same. All my career, I've spent time in not-for-profits and then swung over to work for public sector and governments, then to go out. So I've done that switch about 8 times across my career, and each time I learn something new about the nuances of each part of the sectors. But just quickly going through this, I think the really important construct here is that we actually have a really mixed economy. Not only a mixed economy, but a mixed social care service system that reflects that mixed economy. And yes, it was easier to look at welfare state, universal kinds of constructs in that sort of between the 2 wars, following World War II, around what was going to be universal benefits for the whole system. But as populations grew, as needs also grew, this is the other bit that I think is what was delivered and cared for, let's say for somebody in 1962, the market expectations of what care systems and service systems are in place today is remarkably, or they are poles apart. Over the past 60 years, our expectation of what will be provided, the level of service, and I'll take healthcare because I spent a number of years as a clinician and involved in administration of healthcare systems. Each year, the nature of treatments, the nature of programs of care, of new procedures, new medicines, new approaches grows through research, and rightly so. So what is expected in terms of health outcomes today is vastly different to going back to the early 60s. But what I did want to make sort of the association and illustrate here is that through things like Medicare, Australia has adopted what could be seen as a voucher system that was really born out of the economic theories of Milton Friedman and others that were around that the welfare state had its limitations, and what was required is a greater influence into a more of a market economy, which means that in Australia, I'm free to go to any GP that I like. I know that I have a voucher there, which is my rebate, which can be enable me to purchase a service from a GP. The trouble with that is that over time you can end up with variation. So if I go to GP A or GP B, I may in fact have different treatment regimes which might lead to a different outcome. So I'll go into some of the limitations of that sort of market-led voucher system. Also, it's really difficult to apply in really selected and targeted citizen groups. So if I'm a citizen in 400 k's northeast of Alice Springs, then I don't have access to a market-led economy to go and see my GP. So the Northern Territory has more salaried GPs than any other state and territory for a reason around responding to rural and remote isolation. And I think a question came through around child safety. Once again, child safety and specific groups around that require very sensitive systems that market economies traditionally haven't provided for each of the citizens. If I go to the next slide, I think this is really where I'm trying to illustrate that we have a mixed economy and have a number of economic triggers and levers between governments for the NGOs to play. So, and I've made these are my words, this isn't peer reviewed by any means, this is my assessment of the situation and from my years of experience, that central welfare state is actually work well when it is universal, broad population-based approaches, which means that things like pensions, payments, public hospitals, the provision of those make significant benefit for the public good. So if you want to influence those kinds of relationships, or you're a party to those, then the ability to influence really comes through influencing public policy, being a trusted partner. And one thing that really impresses me, and I'm not sure if we've got anyone from Mission Australia on today, is their annual young people survey. Through that historical publishing that they're able to put together a really good snapshot that does inform public policy and does assist the welfare state refine its levers and triggers to support young people in Australia. Now, mixed models or commissioning frameworks, I've seen a growth of this certainly in Australia in the last 10 years. In the UK, it's been experimented for a while, but which really says that it is about sector reform or harmonisation so that you don't end up with almost the postcode lottery, that a citizen in one postcode receiving a particular service, let's say whether it is GP or even policing, schooling, to some degree the Commonwealth government commissions state governments in terms of how they address health issues. So things like COAG, etc., are actually operating in a commissioning framework where there is this enabling for harmonisation for things like national curriculum, a whole range of things that when I look back 25, 30 years ago when I first, well, let's say 35 years ago when I joined the workforce, it was very different, that each state was actually quite different around even laws or the way that we address schooling. So primary health networks, what is within the ACCHOs or the Aboriginal Community Controlled Health Organisations are a really good example of how this commissioning or collective framework. So for an NGO, often it is about to be a partner, to be involved with, let's say, your local PHN, your local government, to be on reference groups, to be a voice that is part of not only defining what might be or explaining what the problem or the social need is in any given community, but also be party to the description of what might be some of the solutions for that, addressing that particular problem. Now, we've got free market. I've kind of sort of added that, and once going back to your comment as well, Myles, is that free market is really good when there is a highly specified product or service, that there isn't much debate around what is a quality, whether it is pens or something that is very specific and easy to define. It gets problematic when, let's say, we're dealing with sex offenders, or we're dealing with a particular small group that has a higher level of ambiguity and into those and complex in the problems when you've spoken about wicked problems. So it's not the best model for those highly discretionary or sensitive services, nor does it work in remote locations where market forces fail to deliver certain products and services. Dare I say, it's from my history of working with state, mainly in South Australia, not a bad approach to building a car park for a public hospital. You can enter into a partnership and define how many car spaces, what's the price, etc. around that. But if you are involved in market economies, which most of us are, because if we go into NDIS, if we go into that voucher system, we're often competing for our consumers, our citizens, to access our service and bring their voucher to our service. Now, that has been extensively in place now within aged care, and more recently with NDIS, equally with childcare and early childhood settings. So what makes us not only competing for that marketplace, we're often competing with for-profits. So if you're a not-for-profit competing with profits, for-profit organisations, often we're at a disadvantage in terms of our marketing budget, our spread, a whole range of things that make it quite a complex and forever changing environment. Probably the best I can say is that we need to have a very strong value proposition to the citizens that are accessing that service, and demonstrate that good not only to the citizens but ongoing funders of that voucher or market-led economy. Probably the other disadvantage of things like a voucher system, and I'll take aged care and disabilities, is increasingly as the public view of what is acceptable care or acceptable service continues to go up, then we were in these places like we are now with two royal commissions, the one into aged care and the other one into disability services, where, dare I say, a market approach can lead to limit or poor transactions with the consumers and poor outcomes. I'll park the charities piece there because I just think it kind of stands for itself. But increasingly what I'm seeing is that within the charity sector or within niche markets, and I'll use my experience with Movember Foundation. Interestingly, Movember Foundation found that their Movember approach actually, they ended up with so much money is the bottom line. They ended up with more money than what they were expecting. It became, us males that wanted to grow the bad boy chopper reed type mow and get some money for it, enabled them to fund things that they hadn't planned on. And but what it did mean is that they were able to augment, particularly in men's health areas, that the public purse wasn't funding. So probably what I'm intimating here is that keep an eye on this sector, because often it's about this augmenting or topping up. And I'll take, let's say, the McGrath breast care nurses. If we go back to the central welfare state, We have good cancer care nurses for broad cancer, but specifically for breast care, care nursing. The McGrath Foundation has been instrumental in providing additional services and additional coordination that the government, it's just added another level of coordination and care that wasn't present before. Probably what I haven't put up is some newer trends, which is things like social impact bonds. And they're pretty untested. And I think that's, it would be a very brave not-for-profit to go into social impact bonds without the evidence and the context. The risk of doing so, I think, will be incredibly high. The bit that is slightly attractive about it is the focus on outcomes. And whereas a lot of traditional funding models have been about transactions or, let's say, process or basically short-term outcomes rather than long-term outcomes. If maybe outputs is a better descriptor of that. So the space that I think for not-for-profits to really position themselves is to have a mixed portfolio. It's a bit like investment. If you can tap into various funding, because what I've seen over my 35 years is that the colour of government sometimes tweaks the amount of, let's say, free market approaches versus what might be traditionally the welfare state approach of a centralised government doing particular grants and service provision directly themselves. So that's pretty much my quick summary of where I see opportunities. So back to you, Myles.
Thank you, Chris. That was really interesting, and I've got a few questions out of that. But Glenn and Michael, thank you as well. Whilst we're waiting for the chat room to fire up with some questions, can I pose a question to each of you? And that is to do with COVID and particularly the Victorian contracting out of the hotels. Are we likely to see a change of discourse and perhaps behaviour from talking about certain things as customers and clients to citizens' rights? I think Chris touched on this, nursing home expectations have risen. People see it's the citizens' rights. If you get a voucher from government, it should provide a certain level of service. So yeah, I'd just be interested in your thoughts about whether we are seeing and whether we will see a bit of a turn from client customer sort of discourse to citizens' rights discourse. Perhaps we start with you first, Chris, and then go to Glenn and Michael. Chris?
Look, personally, I would be pleased if the discourse was to really reclaim what citizenship is about. Particularly in the last couple of decades, there was certainly around client and consumer, and even the term consumer is perhaps could be argued as being neoliberal in terms of you consume in a marketplace economy. Whereas I think if the discourse really does return to citizen, which is really a stronger rights-based approach around, as a citizen, you have a right to participate, to shape and decide rather than just purchase via a consumer. So personally, I have seen a trend to more conversations around citizenship and citizenship within a health context or in a housing, in an income security. But I think the conversation is really at a fairly early or rudimentary level at this point.
Glenn, any thoughts?
Yes, thanks, Myles. I certainly think that language is important and the words we use help shape what is going on. And I mentioned earlier, governments were talking about grants in aid, they were talking about partnerships, when really they were controlling everything and wanting to tie it down to the last degree. That may sound as though it's critical of governments, but I think it's almost a circular argument, because governments are under pressure from their citizens about accountability and about using money economically wisely and so forth. And so therefore, I think we need to explore that language and come up with some new ways of describing, and perhaps a question for Michael and Chris later on, once we've gone through this, is whether NGOs should stop doing business for government, force government back into doing it themselves or dealing with the private sector, and go back to managing the gaps in the community service delivery. So I think, changing language to understand the citizen rights rather than the commercial stuff would certainly be a step in that direction.
Thanks, Glenn. Over to you, Michael.
Thank you. A great question, Myles. And I, like Chris and I think Glenn too, would welcome a return to a more balanced recognition of our interests and rights as citizens, as much as consumers or customers, as well as members of communities. People's experience of COVID has highlighted all of those identities and interests that we have, but the citizenship one has been a little bit devalued and neglected. Whether or not that leads to a wholesale change in approaches to outsourcing, I'm not so sure. I definitely have long believed that you can outsource service provision, but you can't outsource risk and responsibility. And certainly from my experience in child safety and in other sectors in any public system, my view is if you're a steward and trustee for public funds, you just can't handball it off to a funded entity, whether they're public, private, or an NGO. But I do think there'll be a more nuanced approach to the choices that are made and the way in which standards and quality are commissioned and regulated. And I think there's some very important and very interesting and very challenging sort of debates to be had about, again, what COVID has exposed for example, in our aged care or childcare, or whether it's looking after hotel quarantine, about the way in which standards are set and co-managed. And I think that's going to take us to another level, hopefully, of maturity in how we manage risk and shared the management of risk and responsibility.
Yep, thanks, Michael. Just because I'm chair, I can say risk ought to be managed by the party or parties who can best offset it and manage it. And just simply contractually dumping it on a non-profit who then subcontracts and dumps it on the next non-profit is no way to manage risk. It's neither effective nor efficient. We have some great questions here. Chris, I might ask you, we have a question from Lindy. When you get funded in the short term grants all the time, you end up being output and project based rather than outcomes based. I noticed that you, Chris, talked about outcome production rather than throughput. Yeah. So what's that all about?
Look, I think that is a problem in that we can be funded for essentially transactions or outputs. There's a risk with that we can do transactions or outputs beautifully, but this, and I'm speaking as a not-for-profit employer, without really understanding or not only understanding the related elements. So if I'm responding to one element of somebody's well-being, if I don't understand the connectedness, and if I'm a housing provider or a healthcare provider, actually I'll use the healthcare provider, if I don't understand the impact of homelessness on health outcomes and look at the whole system of that person, then I may be a great person at providing good healthcare, but the outcome of that individual by remaining homeless, their well-being and health is going to be impacted. So I think, once again, there needs to be greater sensitivities to outcomes and using perhaps a program logic approach or something to that effect that actually looks at outputs that we know around previously defined or successful interventions that will ultimately have longer term outcomes rather than just outputs. But it really is the current, within a term of government, it's the way we fund the sector that I would say needs to be readdressed to enable a greater focus on longer term outcomes.
Thanks, Chris. The next one is
Myles.
about competitive. Sorry, Michael.
Sorry, could I just quickly add to that? Look, I think there's a widespread and deep frustration with the current arrangements and the talk of the need to shift to outcomes, the focus on results. Are we making a difference for people? Are we increasing their connection and their agency and their growth and their safety and so on? But we also know that people's lives are incredibly complex, and the places and the contexts in which they live are incredibly complex, and those outcomes are affected by their interaction with a whole range of systems and the choices not only of themselves but of others. And so, the challenge, it's really tough to, and I think there's a bit of a risk that we actually jump to thinking we can actually just commission for outcomes when the factors that affect people's lives are so complicated. And yes, we need a shared focus on outcomes, a learning and development focus, but how smartly we can commission for them, I think needs a lot further consideration.
Thanks, Michael. Again, just because I'm the chair, I'm amazed by the Buurtzorg organisation in the Netherlands, which is about community nursing, and they form. It's a large organisation, but they divide themselves up into small teams of community nurses, no more than a dozen, and they have a franchise area that they look after, and they're really well supported by IT from head office with scheduling and billing. But they negotiated with government that they went out there for outcomes. So when they visited a family, whether it was for aged care nursing or palliative care, they sat down, first thing, sat down and had a long cup of tea and worked out what was the issues. And then they visited the neighbours and other family members to see what support there was. And they, they solved it holistically and quite differently. And it appears to be working. They keep winning industry award after industry awards. And even when the other non-profits got a bit sniffy about them having such great claims to fame and instigated an independent inquiry by government into them, they still came up looking, smelling like roses. So I reckon it can be done. We just need to get there and look at people holistically and let people go in and help to work with people and solve problems. So I'm optimistic with that. But our next question is about competitive tendering. So I wonder if we ask the ex-Auditor-General about competitive tendering in community services, and particularly in outback Queensland where there are very thin markets. There's only one child care centre that can be supported in that community, only one aged care. I mean, how do you have competitive tendering when you've got sunk assets of $2 million of aged care facility or childcare facility? So is competitive tendering working? Over to you, Glenn.
Thanks, Myles. I'm actually on record as saying that competitive tendering isn't the answer to every problem that a bureaucrat faces, because we did an audit a few years ago now of an organisation government department that went into a tender process to get some services, found out that there was really only one supplier, but continued to persevere to try and get a competitive outcome, did a few in the end, dodgy things, trying to get some other organisations to tender, when in fact there was really only one supplier, and if they had have gone through in a way that they were totally entitled to of negotiating an outcome with the sole supplier, they would have got a better outcome. And I've seen quite a number of cases where seemingly competitive tenders have been used for bureaucrats to hide behind that process and not face up to making hard decisions and not come through with really analysing where it is. So my view would be competitive tendering is probably least useful in dealing with community activities and community services, because you have great difficulty in defining what the product is that you're tendering for. The classic for me is Meals on Wheels. Are you really going out to tender for a meal service delivery? Well, there are Uber Eats and a whole range of organisations that can do that. But my view would be Meals on Wheels isn't just about that. It's around a whole heap of other things, and you've just identified, Myles. You need a greater range of activities in that process, and so therefore I don't think competitive tendering is the way to go. You need to have some rigour into the process. You need to have certainly a lot of transparency in the process, but trying to reduce it to something like a widget, like a pencil, like a pen, like a motor car, and go to tender, I think is something that governments really should give up on and move into the other models that I think Michael and Chris have spoken around code design and things like that.
Thanks, Glenn. Michael, just with your experience of trying to provide, say, out-of-home care for youth in Mount Isa or Camberwell or Longreach, I think it's pretty hard for the department. What are your thoughts about, should there be a regional, Queensland be put into regionals where you have competitive tenders and then something else which is more appropriate in thin markets?
Thanks, Myles. Look, indeed, it is incredibly challenging, particularly where you have, as you say, thin markets, where we have inequities of investment and where we have, I guess, very often a fragmentation of service delivery because of it's the accumulation of a whole lot of decisions about program and investment and pilots just add up one after the other. So we get a very fragmented, often very fragmented sort of service system. And of course, the difficulty of competitive tendering is that it unleashes competitive and indeed anti-competitive behaviours when actually for more holistic and integrated approaches to enabling people to shift their life circumstances, we actually need collaboration. So we set the system up for the opposite behaviours and the ones actually that are going to often be most valuable to the people that they're looking to support and to service. So I do think that needs a fundamental rethink, and I think it would be useful to start, as Chris had touched on, looking at whether we go to pooled budgets at a regional level for human and care services. So we've already got the infrastructure and some experience, some learnings of the role of primary health networks, the PHNs. I think it will be really valuable for us to start thinking about, well, might that actually work on a bigger scale across health and care services and investments with really strong community engagement and co-design upfront with community about the sort of the community aspirations and contexts and the sort of outcomes that are going to, and the types of services that are going to have most impact. I think that's definitely something that we should look at in the next couple of years.
Thank you. Chris, from where you're sitting, how does competitive tendering look, particularly in the regions?
Once again, I think if it is a really thin market, I don't think it works. And I've got an example back from my South Australian days, a place called Maree, where the local ambulance driver was the local registered nurse, was the local, and in fact, care was a bit like the Dutch model. Everybody knew people in that neighbourhood. So it was actually really well connected. But as a result, it was about joining various funding. I was on the other side of the government purse at that point, and it was about funding something in a unique way that was outside of competitive tendering. So you enabled the local community to provide the best response rather than, just go down the blanket call for proposals from the market.
Just a question to all three of you. Given that for-profits are starting to come into markets and they're often accused of creaming the market, so they'll take out the lucrative service provision in highly settled and facilitated southeast corner of Queensland or the capital cities, and you'll never find a non-profit, for-profit out in the sticks where things aren't quite so lucrative. That part of the tendering arrangement should be tendering for community benefit, so that to get a lucrative suburban tender, you've got to be out in the sticks as well, taking the losses. What do you think? So got any wings to it, or are there better solutions? Glenn?
Perhaps if I could jump in there, Myles. I think that goes to government being smarter about what it is that they're tendering for. If that's the outcome that they want, yes, they should put together a tender package that requires organisations to as you say, do some of the stuff where they can make some money and cross-subsidise. I think, though, I would probably argue that a better solution would be for government to be more hard-nosed and commercial about the things that they know they can get at the right price, and then have an entirely separate process for dealing with the delivery of services in those smaller remote areas at the cost of actually doing that. So expecting an NGO to do some cross-subsidising internally to deliver services which ultimately the government is responsible for, I think is a cheap shot by government and lazy thinking. So my encouragement would be for government to think more carefully about what it is they're trying to achieve and do it in a way that is delivering those services to everybody within the community, or go back to the days of having people doing it directly for the department rather than trying to outsource.
We've got a question about smaller and larger organisations. Are governments going for economies of scale and not wanting the trouble of dealing with largely volunteer small organisations for the delivery of services and granting for mainstream community services? Chris? Do you think you have economies of scale in your organisation?
We do for certain streams of activity, but I'll give an example where we were potentially squeezed out of let's say emergency relief by a national provider. So we were a niche in a local community, but where we failed to re-win a tender was that what government, and this is the Commonwealth government, wanted to reduce its transaction costs. So instead of engaging 500 local providers, it chose to fund a couple of national providers so that their transaction costs and their transaction ability was reduced around that. So there were savings for the government, net savings for the government at that, I guess, their commissioning opportunity. So I think there is some merit to scale, but equally I think there is some, and if you go back to the Dutch experiment that you highlighted, part of its benefit was that it was local neighbourhoods, that those 8 nurses really worked within discrete neighbourhoods. They knew that neighbourhood really well. They knew not only what was required in healthcare, but other systems like social security or income security for those that they were responsible for. So I think it's going to be always a a fairly treacherous path that we need to tread, that we don't, well, personally, I don't want to be so big that I don't have, or I lose connection to the local community or the client group that I'm serving.
Myles, thank you. Look, my response is really similar to Chris's. I think it's really vitally important that we sustain diversity, diversity of scale and diversity of capability. And I think as I posted in the response in the chat, I think the more important questions are about the capability of organisations, whatever their size, to work well as part of a service system and to be able to demonstrate the strength of their connectivity to their communities that they're working with. And, you know, we had many examples where we would deliberately choose through competitive processes smaller organisations because we more strongly valued the criticality of local connectivity and relationships as a success factor for the sort of results we were looking to partner with that organisation. So, you know, big is not always better.
I think that's the important thing, that government needs to understand what it is that they're wanting to achieve by using the community sector, the not-for-profit sector, in the service delivery. And I think one of the big things that they get out of involving non-for-profit organisations is the connection with the community, the understanding of local needs and understanding of the community. So I wonder, Michael and Chris, whether you've got any comments about how do organisations enter into that debate with government. How do you pass on the knowledge about what is happening in the local community in a way that will shape and form the reactions from government?
Look, I think that is a real opportunity, that as a not-for-profit, what we can describe is our knowledge of that community and the various, let's say, needs, and how we, if we have been a historical provider, how we have met those needs. It's definitely an opportunity for a not-for-profit to explain how they know the community and describe the benefit that they can provide in partnership with local community citizens. So I just think it's a real opportunity.
And I guess I'd just share an example, I think, of one of the best efforts that we made in this sort of along these lines was actually driven by the leadership from the Queensland Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community sector, particularly Quadsip and Quake and Snake, in the approach that we took to the investment in First Nations family wellbeing services. So, you know, what we might have typically and done usually was just jump straight into a procurement process. But the very, very strong advice and very sound advice was that we actually needed a long, careful, deliberate, arm's length process of co-design with communities to devise the right models and the right approach to developing and deploying and partnering with on those services. And it was a very different and challenging approach for public servants, but a really incredibly valuable exercise to work in partnership to actually hand over some of the power and control over the development and design to community-led organisations, and to allow the models to come out of a genuine co-design and community engagement process. And that led to a much more robust agreement about what was to be invested for and ultimately who. So that was a really pivotal example for us, and hopefully one that's going to be replicated.
Thank you, Michael. I think we've got our last question of this evening, and then we'll wrap up. And it's a really interesting one. Left field, perhaps. Perhaps governments should collect more taxes to provide them more wriggle room for funding community services. And I know, you know, the newspaper polls say, you know, people would like more services and be willing to pay more taxes rather than to receive a tax break, but is it reasonable, or is it plausible, is it possible that governments are going to collect more taxes to provide more community services for their citizens? I'll start with you, Glenn, and then go to Chris, and Michael can have the final word, having been in the hot seat of having to juggle Treasury and budget. So, Glenn, more taxes for more services?
I think that's a debate that we probably need to have, and I suspect the current climate with the way that we're handling COVID and the outcomes that are coming from there, which will probably also impact on a discussion about how we pay for all the debt and all the expenditure of government today. But I think there does need to be a bit more reality brought into that discussion about what is it that the communities are looking for and who's willing to pay. And we seem to have got to a situation where the community's expectations about government providing all of these services has crept in over many years. As I said in my introductory comments, back in the 70s or 80s, the services that government provided were fairly well defined, and the not-for-profit sector, the community sector, tended to pick up the add-ons and the gaps. We've now moved to a stage where all of those things are seen as essential services to be delivered by government, and that, I think, means that someone's got to pay. So one way or another, we either pull back on our demands of government, or we've got to be willing to pay some more taxes.
Thank you, Chris.
Numerically, I think it is inevitable, just purely for the ageing population. So for the next period of time, up until about 2055, the requirements of an ageing population, particularly in healthcare and direct aged care services, means numerically our taxation base, particularly from an income tax, won't cut the mustard. So possibly a new taxation or a wider based goods and services tax is required so that those that are no longer working can continue to pay a taxation. I can't see no other way numerically unless everyone takes a cut in the level of or user pay models for care provision, which I don't think is the Australian context.
You've mentioned GST, but Australia is almost unique in the OECD by not having a wealth tax. Even the US has a wealth tax. But over to you, Michael.
Thank you. Look, I concur with Myles, with Chris and Glenn's comments. I guess what I'd add is I think this is one of the most lamentable failures of the public sphere in Australia for the last 2 decades, is our seeming inability to have a nuanced, evidence-based, clever, open, trusting debate with the public about the trade-offs and the choices about the levels of service and support and infrastructure, hard and social infrastructure, and the appropriate sort of tax settings, and despite all the efforts. I think it is, again, another opportunity though with COVID, even though we saw some tax measures, tax cuts at least, in the federal budget recently. I think there is still space for a lively public debate about, particularly as Chris said, how are we going to get a more robust and fair and sustainable care systems to meet citizens and consumer expectations and community expectations over the next 5, 10, 20 years. We've got to have that debate again about taxation.
Well, that brings us to a close for this evening. We'll have more honest conversation events planned for 2021. So if you'd like to email us at ACPNS with an honest conversation topic, we would be most grateful to receive that. Thank you very much. Have a good evening, and we wish you all the best in the future.